The Waldorf Astoria. New York closed on March 4, 2017. The hotel had been operating continuously for 87 years. It had hosted every sitting American president since Herbert Hoover. It had been the temporary residence of General Douglas MacArthur, the permanent New York address of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, the site of more state dinners and diplomatic receptions than any other private building in the country. When it closed, the press release said it was closing for renovations. That was true, in the way that many true things are also incomplete. The renovation was expected to take 2 years. It has now been 8. The hotel has not reopened. The tower above it, 35 floors of luxury residential condominiums sold to buyers across the United States and internationally, remains unfinished. Some of the people who bought units in that tower paid their deposits in 2015. They are still waiting. The man who ran the company that sold those units was convicted of fraud in China in 2018 and sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. He is there today. In the United States, no one has been charged with anything. This is the story of how $1.4 billion of pre-sold luxury real estate on Park Avenue ended up in a legal limbo that has now lasted nearly a decade. How the most famous hotel address in America became a construction site with a completion date that keeps moving, and why the buyers who did everything right, who signed contracts, wired money through proper channels, trusted licensed professionals, and believed in the protections that American real estate law is supposed to provide, found themselves exposed to a risk that none of those protections were designed to absorb. But before we get to the buyers, we need to understand what they were buying into. Because the Waldorf Astoria was not just a hotel, it was a symbol. And the story of what it meant, and what it became, and what it is now, is inseparable from the story of why its sale to a Chinese insurance conglomerate was allowed to happen at all. The original Waldorf Astoria opened in 1931 on the site of the old Waldorf Astoria on 34th Street, which had been demolished to make way for the Empire State Building. The new building, designed by the architectural firm Schultz and Weaver in the Art Deco style that defined New York's skyline ambitions of that era, rose 47 stories above Park Avenue between 49th and 50th Streets. It was, at the time of its completion, the tallest and largest hotel in the world. It contained over 1,400 rooms. Its grand ballroom could seat over 1,000 guests. Its kitchens operated around the clock to serve a clientele that included heads of state, industrial titans, entertainers, diplomats, and anyone else whose life had reached a point where the Waldorf Astoria was the natural address. The hotel became woven into the fabric of American political and cultural life in a way that no other private building has quite replicated. President Herbert Hoover stayed there. Franklin Roosevelt used the Waldorf as his New York base throughout his presidency. Harry Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, both Bushes, Clinton, and Obama all stayed there. General Douglas MacArthur lived at the Waldorf for 13 years after his removal from command in Korea until his death in 1964. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor maintained a suite there for decades. Frank Sinatra, Marilyn Monroe, and Cole Porter are among the many entertainers who stayed or visited. The list of people who passed through the Waldorf Astoria reads like a cast list for the 20th century. The hotel also had a more discreet institutional role. The United States Secret Service maintained a permanent operational facility inside the building. Several floors were historically reserved for foreign dignitaries and heads of state under diplomatic protection. The physical infrastructure of the building, its dedicated electrical systems, its secure communications lines, its private entrances and service corridors, had been integrated into federal security protocols over decades in ways that most of the hotel's paying guests never knew. The Waldorf Astoria was not just a luxury hotel. It was, in certain specific and classified ways, a piece of American national security infrastructure. This is one of the reasons why, when Anbang Insurance Group announced in 2014 that it intended to purchase the Waldorf Astoria for $1.95 billion, there were people in Washington who were not immediately comfortable with the idea. To understand what happened at the Waldorf Astoria, you have to understand what Anbang Insurance Group was, because it was not what it appeared to be. And by the time most people understood that, the transaction was already done. Anbang was founded in 2004 in Beijing as an auto insurance company. For its first several years, it was unremarkable, a small regional insurer operating in a market with dozens of competitors. Then, around 2009, something changed. The company began growing at a rate that the Chinese insurance industry had not seen before. It expanded from auto insurance into life insurance, into investment products, into wealth management vehicles that it sold to retail investors across China, with promises of returns that were substantially higher than anything a conventional insurer investing in conventional assets could have reliably produced. Analysts who looked at Anbang's public filings during this period noted that its stated asset values did not always reconcile cleanly with its known acquisition history. The company said it had hundreds of billions of dollars in assets under management. The assets it had publicly acquired did not account for those numbers in any way that outside observers could trace. When Chinese regulators asked questions, they received answers. The answers were apparently sufficient to keep the company's licenses current. The growth continued. By 2014, Anbang had acquired the Dutch insurance group Vivat, had purchased the South Korean insurer Tongyang Life, had bought the American company Fidelity and Guarantee Life, a retirement-focused insurer with policyholders across the United States, and was in active negotiations for additional international acquisitions. Chairman Wu Xiaohui was one of the most prominent business figures in China. He had married a granddaughter of Deng Xiaoping. His access to Chinese political networks was understood to be significant. His company's international ambitions were presented as a natural extension of China's growing global economic presence. In October of 2014, Anbang announced the purchase of the Waldorf Astoria. The price, $1.95 billion, was not just a record for a single hotel transaction. It was a statement. It said that a Chinese financial institution, 20 years after China had begun its integration into the global economy, was now in a position to buy the most symbolically loaded hotel address in American history. At the price Anbang paid, the transaction would never generate a conventional real estate return on invested capital from hotel operations alone. The numbers did not work that way. What Anbang was buying was partly a building and partly something harder to quantify, a name, a position, a presence in the American market that money alone cannot create from scratch. The Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States reviewed the transaction. CFI-US is the interagency federal body responsible for evaluating whether foreign acquisitions of American businesses or assets pose risks to national security. Given the Waldorf Astoria's long-standing relationship with the Secret Service and its role in housing foreign heads of state under diplomatic protection, there were legitimate questions about what it would mean for a Chinese company to own the physical infrastructure of that building. Those questions were raised. The review took place. CFI-US approved the transaction. The sale closed in February of 2015. Whatever concerns existed about the national security implications of the sale, they were resolved or set aside or overridden in ways that were not made public. The classified elements of the federal facilities inside the building were presumably addressed through some combination of lease modifications, access agreements, and operational adjustments that allowed the building to be sold while preserving whatever functions the government needed to preserve. The full details of how that was handled have never been made public. What is public is that the sale was approved and that the Secret Service, within a few years, relocated the presidential operations that had been based at the Waldorf Astoria to other New York facilities. Anbang's stated development plan was straightforward on paper. The hotel's historic public spaces, the grand lobby, the ballrooms, the restaurants, the corridors with their original Art Deco detailing, would be restored and reopened as a luxury hotel under the Waldorf Astoria brand, which Hilton retained through a long-term licensing agreement. The upper 35 floors would be converted into private residential condominiums and sold as the Waldorf Astoria Residences, New York. Approximately 375 units were planned, ranging from one-bedroom apartments of just over 1,000 square feet to multi-bedroom residences exceeding 6,000 square feet. Prices were set between approximately $1.8 million and $18 million per unit. Sales launched in 2015. The marketing operation was substantial. Presentation suites were established. Prospective buyers were brought in and shown architectural renderings, material samples, finish options, and floor plans that had been developed by some of the most prestigious design firms in the industry. The Waldorf Astoria name carried a weight in the luxury real estate market that most new developments spend years and hundreds of millions of dollars in branding trying to approach. You were not buying an apartment in a new tower. You were buying a piece of a building that had been part of American history for nearly a century. You were buying an address that people recognized on every continent. Buyers signed contracts. They wired deposits. Standard practice in New York. Luxury residential pre-sales requires that deposits be held in escrow, in accounts administered by a neutral third party, typically a title insurance company, held in trust and inaccessible to the developer for general operating purposes. The escrow structure is one of the foundational protections in pre-construction real estate sales. It exists precisely because of the risk that a developer might fail or default before a building is completed, and it is designed to ensure that if that happens, buyers can recover their money rather than becoming unsecured creditors in a bankruptcy proceeding. Buyers were told their deposits were protected. That was what the contract said. That was what the escrow arrangements were supposed to guarantee. In 2017, the Waldorf Astoria closed. Construction commenced. The exterior scaffolding went up on Park Avenue and has been there in various configurations ever since. The initial timeline called for the hotel to reopen in 2019 and for residential closings to begin around the same time. Then the Chinese government moved. In the summer of 2017, Chinese financial regulators began restricting Anbang's ability to sell new insurance and investment products domestically. The restrictions were the first public indication that the regulatory accommodation Anbang had enjoyed for nearly a decade was ending. In November of 2017, Wu Xiaohui was detained by Chinese authorities. No charges were announced. No statement explained why. People familiar with Chinese regulatory enforcement recognize the pattern: the quiet detention, the absence of immediate charges, and the period of investigation conducted outside public view. The charges, when they came, would reflect a case that was already complete. In March of 2018, Wu Xiaohui was formally charged. The Chinese government's accusation was specific and sweeping. He had illegally raised funds from retail investors across China over a period of more than 10 years, misrepresenting the nature and risk of Anbang's financial products. He had used the money raised from Chinese policyholders to fund international acquisitions, to service earlier obligations, and to divert funds to himself and to associates. The Chinese prosecutors alleged that more than 10 billion yuan, approximately $1.5 billion at the exchange rates of that period, had been misappropriated. The trial lasted 1 day. On May 10, 2018, Wu Xiaohui was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 18 years in prison. His personal assets were confiscated. He was ordered to repay the diverted funds. On the same day, the Chinese government announced that it was seizing full control of Anbang Insurance Group and placing it under the direct administration of the China Banking and Insurance Regulatory Commission. The seizure was one of the largest government takeovers of a private Chinese financial institution in the history of the People's Republic. The government stated that Anbang's solvency had been impaired by illegal operations and that the seizure was necessary to protect Chinese policyholders and maintain financial stability. The unwinding of Anbang's international holdings began. The American retirement company Fidelity and Guarantee Life was sold. The European holdings were sold. The South Korean insurer was sold. Each divestiture was handled separately, through different processes, and the proceeds went towards satisfying Anbang's obligations to Chinese policyholders, who were the primary victims of the fraud that Wu Xiaohui had been convicted of perpetrating. The Waldorf Astoria was different. It was not a standalone financial asset that could be valued and sold through a clean auction process. It was a partially complete construction project with hundreds of pre-sale contracts, deposit obligations, a long-term hotel brand licensing agreement with Hilton, ongoing construction contracts, and a capital structure that had been assembled over years by a team that was now either in prison or under government supervision. The successor entity, eventually renamed Dajia Insurance Group, inherited all of it. It inherited the project, the contracts, the obligations, the lawsuits, and the problem of how to continue building a luxury tower valued at $1.4 billion on Park Avenue when the organization that had designed it no longer existed in its original form. For the buyers, the transition produced a specific and serious problem. The escrow accounts that were supposed to hold their deposits, the protection that every buyer in a pre-construction sale is told is the guarantee that their money is safe, had not in all cases functioned as intended. In some instances, funds that were supposed to be held in escrow had been drawn upon. The specific details varied by contract and by buyer and by the structure of the particular escrow arrangement, and the full picture of what happened to every deposit in the Waldorf Astoria residential sales program has never been publicly established in its entirety, because the litigation that followed was extensive and much of it was settled confidentially. What is known is that buyers who attempted to recover their deposits found themselves in a situation that the standard American legal framework for real estate escrow protection was not fully equipped to handle. A deposit held in a New York escrow account in a transaction governed by New York law, administered by a licensed American title company, should be recoverable under American law if the developer defaults. The problem is that the developer in this case was not an American company that had gone bankrupt. It was a Chinese state-controlled entity that was simultaneously the subject of government seizure proceedings in Beijing, the defendant in multiple American lawsuits, the party to hundreds of purchase contracts, and the owner of a building that was still being constructed. The legal proceedings required to recover funds from that entity took years. Some buyers hired firms that specialize in exactly this kind of cross-border insolvency litigation. Some received partial recoveries. Some accepted modified contracts that changed the terms of their purchase in ways that reflected the new reality of the project rather than what they had originally agreed to. Some are still involved in legal proceedings that began years ago and have not been resolved. No American executive was charged with a crime in connection with the Waldorf Astoria transaction. The title company that administered the escrow accounts was not prosecuted. The attorneys who structured the transaction were not sanctioned in ways that became public. The federal regulators who approved the transaction, including the members of CFY US who cleared the sale in 2015, were not held accountable for having approved a transaction with a buyer whose internal financial structure, as the Chinese government established in court 3 years later, was fraudulent at its foundation. This is not to say that American regulators acted in bad faith. CFI US reviews national security risk, not financial integrity. The agency's mandate does not include investigating whether a foreign buyer's internal accounts are legitimate. The regulators who approved the Waldorf Astoria sale were doing what they were authorized to do within the scope of the law as written. The law as written did not require them to verify that the money Anbang was using to buy the building was money that Anbang was legally entitled to use. That gap between what the regulatory system was designed to catch and what actually happened is where the buyers fell. Walk past the Waldorf Astoria on Park Avenue today. The scaffolding is still there. The marquee is dark. The building that defined New York luxury hospitality for nearly a century, that housed the operational apparatus of American presidential security for decades, that was the mailing address of generals and monarchs and heads of state, is a construction site. The upper floors are partially complete. Some windows are dark. Some show interior construction activity. The street-level storefronts that once housed the hotel's retail and dining operations are empty behind plywood hoardings. The building is expected to reopen. The timeline has moved multiple times. The most recent publicly available projections suggest the hotel may open in the next year or two, and residential closings may follow. Some buyers who have waited since 2015 may eventually receive their units. Others remain in situations that have not been resolved. The completion of the project, if and when it happens, will not change the fact that people wired deposits a decade ago for apartments they were told would be ready in 2019. Wu Xiaohui is 60 years old. If he serves his full sentence, he will not be released until he is in his late 70s. He is in a Chinese prison on the other side of the world from the building he bought and the buyers whose money funded the years of construction that preceded his arrest. In the United States, no one is going to prison for what happened to those buyers. That is not a grievance. It is not a political argument. It is a description of what the record shows. The record shows that a transaction was approved, that representations were made, that deposits were collected, that escrow protections did not function as buyers understood them to function, that the developer's chairman was convicted of fraud by his own government, and that the American legal and regulatory system produced no criminal accountability for any of it. 8 years, $1.4 billion, 375 apartments, hundreds of buyers, one man in prison in China. The scaffolding on Park Avenue is still there. That is what accountability looks like when the money was always somewhere else.